Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bayne.
I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
And I'm James.
I'm really glad to have you with us today, James.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Your wife was with us on the podcast last week as we talked about the Schuyler sisters. Really excited to have you here because you were my college roommate and you were kind of my introduction to Hamilton, you and your wife together.
She was here last week. She told me she's been in Chicago for 3 weeks.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
This might be a problem.
Okay, all right, okay. Yeah, we did. We went to college together, and high school and middle school.
Yeah,
all
that's
of those,
true.
and you were just there the whole time.
It's a lot
The
of schools.
entire time.
Yeah, just right there, same room.
We did choir together. We were in a couple of musicals together, actually.
Yep,
You're
all just
Guys and Dolls actually might have been
so
the only
many
one.
things.
I was Sky Masterson and you were Nicely, right?
Yeah, we were in West Side Story too. You were
Oh
in
yeah,
that.
in college. You were the lead in that one.
I mean,
Tony,
I think
right?
Something. Yeah. Is that a guy in the show? No, yeah, I was that one.
Sweet.
So you saw the musical live.
Yes, we saw it at the end of July. I mean, Rebecca talked about it, so I'm sure if anything interesting happened while we were there, she probably already covered it. Did she talk about the drunk lady?
No.
No.
Oh, okay. So we had orchestra seats. They were really good, and then this woman came in halfway through the second song probably, and the way that these rows are, they're so tightly formatted that everyone has to get up and like lean back so that she can walk through to her seat. So she came in, and so various times in the first act, she's standing up, one person standing ovation at, inappropriate times, like, somebody, I don't know, got shot or whatever, and some not the appropriate times, and she's cheering. And then, so about 15 minutes before the first act ended, she gets up and makes everyone stand up next to her to get out. And then we see her walk back, and then we just hear like a dum 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 dum, which is her it has to be her falling down a giant flight of stairs because we had to climb all these stairs to get. So that I think that was her rolling down 50 stairs.
Was she okay?
And then there's like some like a low rumbling of voices of everyone around us, like trying. This is about the point where they've just won the war and John Lawrence gets shot, and so they're singing the song where he's a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sad, and then this happens, and then so that was fun, and then at the end, Rebecca heard through some of her connections that like everybody on the stage actually knew that something was going on as well. They didn't let on, so. That was pretty entertaining.
Because they're professionals.
Yeah. So that was fun. She's probably fine.
I hope so. I'm sure. This week we're going back to catch the 3 songs we skipped last week. The Farmer Refuted, You Will Be Back, and Right Hand Man. These 3 songs kind of cover Hamilton's rise from his days at King's College up to becoming the right-hand man of George Washington with the interlude of King George, which is just a fantastic, fun song we'll talk about in just a second. We discussed on a previous podcast what the atmosphere was like at King's College when Hamilton was going there. It's a really conservative school, loyal to the king in a lot of different ways, but there were a lot of these rabble-rousers who were coming around, and the students were becoming pretty engaged in the revolutionary events happening around their university.
They were roused by the rabble.
They were.
One day, actually, and this may lead into the story, this may actually take us way off point, but there was a really neat little interlude where while Hamilton was still a student there, these Sons of Liberty came in and they were attacking the university because they wanted to capture the president, who was a known loyalist to the throne. And I don't know what they were going to do with him, but they were attacking the university, going up into the college where the president lived. And Hamilton actually stood in the stairway and blocked the people who were trying to come up to take the president away, and bought the president enough time just by speaking to the angry mobs, trying to calm them down, trying to get orderly about this whole thing. And so he was actually defending this guy that was his mentor at the college because he cared a lot about making sure we do things in an orderly way rather than just coming in and taking the civilians off the streets. So in the middle of these really hectic events, you see a lot of different ideas being thrown out there. One such idea comes from this man named Samuel Seabury, who publishes his letter into the newspaper, and he writes under a pseudonym A.W. Farmer, a Westchester farmer. The Congress has put out their specific thoughts on how they need the War of Independence to go, and Samuel Seabury is loyal to the throne, and so this song in particular is going to introduce us first to what one of these loyalists thinks about the revolution.
They don't like it.
Samuel Seabury presents free thoughts on the proceedings of the Continental Congress, saying that he does not approve of the revolution, saying that this Congress does not speak for him, saying that this violence and bloodshed is wrong, and that we shouldn't try to find a way to separate ourselves from the king.
And that was a pretty common thought at those times. Like the Revolutionary War, we think of it from modern times, but in the context there were a lot of people that saw it as a civil war, thinking we are British people, we are British subjects living in a British colony, and they saw this as tearing their family, tearing their country apart.
It's true.
So James, what can you tell us about the staging in this particular song?
I don't remember. He was on a box, and they're like around him because they're in a town square. So I don't know. I saw it. But yeah, so it's pretty cool. And then of course Hamilton comes in and he's using all the guys' rhymes against him, which is always fun. It's kind of, and they do a counterpoint, kind of like a musical thing, but it's literally a counterpoint as well, because that's always fun to do two things where it's one thing. Right. You guys know about that? Would they do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that a lot because there are a lot of moments, a lot of the phrases where Samuel Seabury will start off saying chaos and bloodshed are not a solution, and then Hamilton, kind of like he does in his responses when he's writing, he takes their point and then turns it against them himself by saying chaos and bloodshed already haunt us, so you don't get to choose whether like you're going to have chaos and bloodshed. That's already here, guys. And so he's looking at him and he turns whatever phrase he starts against him in his argument. So in their correspondence in the newspaper, A.W. Farmer, a.k.a. Samuel Seabury, presented this letter, free thoughts on the proceedings of the Continental Congress. Hamilton responds to him, and then Seabury presents one more thing, and Hamilton writes a farmer refuted, and that gets him kind of into the middle of the spotlight where he kind of takes some fame at this point in time.
Did you guys talk about how Hamilton, he's a pretty smart guy? Like, I'm pretty sure this is one of his first writings, and it's when he's like 18 or something like that.
I think he's 19. There's a debate about his age anyways, but yeah, 18 or 19.
Well, I don't want to take sides in the debate because who cares? But 18, 19, it's pretty close. And so he's good at writing.
Yeah, he's
very
pretty young to be jumping into a game like this in political debates.
Well, and I mean, a lot of young people care about these things, but they wouldn't be able to write on the level that he did, which is pretty good.
Yeah, incredibly high level.
So, and of course, he carries those big ideas that he has thinking outside his personal experience on how to actually form an entire country, which basically the way that our whole economy works is based off of him, which whether or not that's good or bad, but
it is what it is. I like how Hamilton isn't necessarily the first one we hear responding to Seabury at this moment. You see Mulligan stepping forward and saying, "Oh my God, tear this dude apart," urging Hamilton to take the stage. When we saw them at the end of the tavern scene, you saw that Lauren specifically announced, "We need to get this dude in front of a crowd."
Yeah.
And here Mulligan is another one of his friends urging him to write this response, urging him to step up to the podium, to take Samuel Seabury down. And it's like they're trying to push him forward to say something.
Yeah, he kind of represents the frustration of the revolutionaries with this type of writing.
Mm-hmm.
This song also, it kind of has the first example of a theme that they do in the show where the revolutionaries are contrasted with the British people, in that the British people are very like old-fashioned. Their rhymes are very simple. They're talking in hoity-toity language. And the revolutionaries are like the young upstarts that are doing the complicated rapping and stuff. And they're mostly played by people of color. And it's just a choice that they went with in the show that's really striking and works really well.
I think it is striking. It's a really good contrast there.
And it's funny because it gets you to laugh at all the dorky British people.
On that note, you have Seabury, who's not actually a farmer, but a reverend, right?
Yeah, he was an influential bishop or preacher, something along those lines.
Yeah, and as James mentioned, you have people of color playing these revolutionaries who are the oppressed here in this situation. And then you have Seabury, who's played by a white guy. He's an influential person of privilege in this situation. And he doesn't necessarily have to deal with these problems, but he's the one standing up on the soapbox telling them, hey, everyone, calm down. Don't riot. Don't revolt. Just, this is good for you. It's all good for you. And everything's going great to these people who are experiencing these problems and have to deal with them. And that actually brings to mind, to me, Ferguson in this situation where you have this oppressed few people, these people dealing with these problems and getting angry over the things that are happening in the current state of affairs and not willing to sit by it and be idle with it, but wanting change and reformation to come. And then these people in places of privilege and power telling them, hey, stop rioting. Things are fine. But they're not the people that have to deal with those problems.
Yeah.
Alexander's friends here are telling him to shut this guy down, get up there and debate with him.
But not all of Hamilton's friends are trying to urge him on.
No, you see Burr stand up with his normal stance on things, which is let him be. Let's not interject. Let's not say anything. Let's just let him say what he wants to say, and we're not going to say anything back.
Typical Aaron Burr.
So in the staging here, you see that Samuel Seabury was up on his actual soapbox announcing this thing. When Mulligan urges Hamilton forward, he starts to walk towards the soapbox, and then Aaron Burr intercepts him and says, let him be. And so Hamilton looks away for a minute. Burr walks away. Samuel Seabury sings the last lines, I pray the king shows you his mercy, for shame. And then Hamilton goes around Burr, runs up to the soapbox, tries to steal it from him, and he says, yo, he'd have you all unravel at the sound of screams, but the revolution is coming. The have-nots are going to win this. It's hard to listen to you with a straight face. And so he is trying to steal the microphone. He is trying to steal the audience. He's trying to outspeak Samuel Seabury. For every word that Seabury says, Hamilton's trying to fit a ton of extra words on him. In debate, we called it 10-point, where someone makes 1 point and you try to give them lots of different points underneath it, so where they cannot refute anything you say. So Hamilton's trying to steal the attention of the audience, and you see them through the next little bit fighting back and forth, trying to be the loudest person on the soapbox.
Yeah, and I like how it goes at the same time. The raps are at the same time. It's not necessarily a back and forth where they're taking turns. They kind of going over each other, which kind of to me represents the thoughts existing at the same time in the same country. You don't have a debate where they're actually talking back and forth. These two papers were printed separately, and these thoughts are going over each other in the country, and there's separate people that they're thinking each of them at the same time. And that just is just cool representation to me for how those thoughts exist at the same time in the same place amongst the people, rather than a back and forth swaying.
Yeah. Rarely is our civil discourse in American politics very civil. No. Usually we have this talking back and forth, talking over one another to be heard, and that does pretty much characterize what the nation was like at that point. Everyone is fighting to be heard, fighting for their voice to be heard, because they think if you go down that route, you may very well end our entire structure of society, and everyone feels uncomfortable. Everyone's uneasy with that. Pretty quickly, this conversation turns into insults.
My dog speaks more eloquently than thee.
But strangely, your mange is the same.
Yeah, so this is the point. So I guess once the guy starts repeating his exact same verse for the third time, it's kind of the situation where Hamilton has given up trying to reason with this person because he didn't try to even refute any of the things he said. He just repeated his exact same argument with. So, I mean, a lot of people can sympathize with that at a certain point. Then you just resort to insulting them because that's more fun and they're not listening to what you're saying anyway.
Yeah, that if you repeat yourself again, I'm going to scream.
Honestly, look at me. Please don't read. My favorite line in this whole thing is, don't modulate the key, then not debate with me.
Interestingly enough, they modulated the key.
And before the song is over, he does make one more legitimate argument when he says, why should a tiny island across the sea regulate the price of tea? So he brings up this whole issue with the tea stamp, tea taxes, and the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre from a few years ago that really incited the colonists to behave in a certain way already. And then you see the final interaction where Burr is trying to shut Alexander up, saying, Alexander, please calm
Talk
down.
less.
I've always been on Britain's side.
Oh, yeah?
Well, I mean, when we learned about this whole thing in 5th grade, it was like everything they were saying basically made sense. It's like, well, we paid for the French and Indian War for you, and so you pay us some taxes. It seems reasonable to me.
It also seems reasonable to have representation in Parliament, I suppose.
Yeah, but it's like, who cares? You know, that's kind of always been like, yeah, representation, but also who cares? You know, it's kind of like a way. It's like it's a balancing test.
That's the other side of the argument.
I can name a few people that cared, I suppose.
Yeah, well,
I've never seen anyone that cared. I don't remember that part.
yeah, so
That does bring up an interesting point that history is written by the winners. And we are, in this particular context, the winners of American history. So we write it as if our heroes are the heroes, and the British loyalists are the ones that are the bad guys, so to speak.
I've thought about this before, but I've never actually sought out answers. I wonder how this scenario, this part of history, is taught in not America.
I think they just kind of downplay the significance of the whole thing. Like, it was like, yeah, they lost this war, but they were really more concerned about what was going on with France. And they just kind of thought, well, okay, well, we'll let them have their country for now. And the way that their constitution is set up, they'll be begging for us to come back in a decade anyway. And so then we'll come back and then we'll tax them. And so that's kind of the perspective that they had. And I think that that's how they teach it. They just don't act like it's as big of a deal.
Right. It's something that happened, but it's not necessarily as heroic as we teach it.
And you know, they've lost a lot of territory that they once had at this point.
There's no such thing as a British empire anymore. This is a theme from Hamilton the musical itself, where you see that you have no control who lives, who dies, who tells your story. History has its eyes on these people, and the people who remain will paint it in whatever light they want it to be in. But the people that are actually having those debates didn't have the benefit of hindsight to know where exactly their war was going to take history.
So at this point, we get a letter from the king in the song, and it transitions to our next song, You'll Be Back.
Silence, a message from Jonathan Groff as he takes the stage.
So this is like a love letter from King George to the colonists, and it's portrayed as the very different style than all the other songs in the show. It's kind of like a pop, please take me back song. Mm-hmm. It draws on a lot of Beatles songs. It's kind of like a literal British invasion.
I see what he did there.
Because they invasion, but also the songs. So yeah, this is fun. It's kind of like again, they do, the whole humor is based off of the British being the out of touch old people and their new revolutionaries with their complicated rhyme schemes and everything. And so King George comes out in this song, and he's wearing like this over the top regal attire that doesn't even look like there's a person under it because it's so elaborate. Everybody's just laughing before he even says anything. And he moves at like a glacial pace where he's just totally unconcerned with hitting his mark on time. So it's pretty funny. I guess this is the first song that Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote for the show.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He said that in some sort of interview, which it's kind of bizarre, I guess. I don't know, but it's kind of funny. The tone of the song that he's singing, it mirrors some addresses to Parliament that he gave closely before and after receiving the Declaration of Independence, where he basically talks about how the Americans should be loyal and they're his loyal subjects, but also how he's going to use force to put a speedy end to the revolt. So it's kind of this juxtaposition that they do in the song as well, where he's reinforcing how much he cares for these people and how he's going to be their protective force, but then he's going to send a fully armed battalion to destroy their friends and family and everything they care about.
This is the song that I find the easiest to share with my family members in particular whenever I'm telling them about this musical that I love. They're not so much the hip hop lovers that a lot of us are, but they do love music theater, and so I shared this song with them, and as soon as King George says that line, and when push comes to shove, I'll send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love, and they just bust up laughing. Every person I've shared this with has just died at that point.
It goes from being like the love leather to the creepy stalker, pushy boyfriend leather really quick with that line.
Right, which is also very intentional. It's kind of like a lot of those songs are kind of stalkerish if you actually paid attention to the lyrics.
Yeah.
So the drunk lady loved this one. She stood up, full applause, just wouldn't stop. It was pretty entertaining.
She like start cheering for King George. I love
Yeah.
King George.
Yeah.
He's the best.
Can we talk about how amazing Jonathan Groff is when he actually performs this in the cast recording?
Yeah, it's really, really well done.
So good. So who actually was playing the role of King George when you saw it, James?
That was Jonathan Groff.
Okay, good.
We saw it like a week or two before the official Broadway opening, but it was already in the theater that they're doing it, and it was, so they were just doing previews, but it was the whole original cast.
Nice, okay.
And it was pretty good. He did a good job. I liked it.
Yeah, he does a good enough physical performance that Beyonce wanted to borrow that walk.
Yeah.
We mentioned that last time.
So they always bring in these King George songs kind of before or after a more intense moment in the show. This is right before Right Hand Man. They do another reprise of this right after Battle of Yorktown. So it's kind of just always, once you've had a few too many serious things in a row, then they bring in something like this.
To lighten the mood a little bit.
Lighten the mood. They say, let's get back to politics.
Please.
All right, so that takes us to our next song, Right Hand Man.
Right Hand Man is one of my favorite songs in this show, which don't put a lot of stock in that. I'll probably say that all of these songs are my favorite songs.
We'll say that over and over again with every recording.
Right. It depends on the week as to which is my favorite. But I really enjoy story songs, and this is one of the first songs where you really see they're not just introducing themselves to the audience, they're actually telling a whole story in the middle of this particular song, and it's really well done.
Yeah, I also like the song.
So the first line of this song, British Admiral Howe's got troops on the water, 32,000 troops in New York Harbor. I've been reading a book on military strategies from the Revolutionary War this week, and it's been really interesting because this was kind of just that throwaway setup context for this song for me for the longest time. Then I realized that as the author of this other book was pointing out to me, New York is an island surrounded by water, and when you have a really good navy, you have the strategic advantage anywhere in New York City. When you're trying to defend an island and your enemy has ships that are faster than yours, that are larger than yours, and have more artillery than yours, Washington was facing this really serious problem where he knew that wherever he put his forces, the British could outflank him at any moment almost. They would just get on their ships, go to the other side, and they could cut off his forces immediately.
So the island isn't that big. 32,000 troops surrounding it. That's a lot for a small island.
Yeah, the British were actually building up their forces mostly on Staten Island, while Washington had forts all over the place. He had a couple forts in Manhattan itself. He knew that he had to hold on to Brooklyn, and so he had 3 forts in Brooklyn Heights, one for Lord Stirling, one for Nathaniel Greene, and another for this guy that I don't remember. His name's probably not important. And so our kid Hamilton was actually an auxiliary captain leading his own little troop of people with their own cannons at Fort George in Manhattan himself. So Hamilton brings us in after we see the context, and he says, as a kid in the Caribbean, I was wishing for a war. I knew that I didn't have the resources to make myself into someone important. I knew that the war was the only way I could rise up. I knew that if they tell my story, I would either die on a battlefield in glory or I would rise up.
Yeah, we saw that sentiment when he met Aaron Burr. God, I wish there was a war where we could prove that we're worth more than anyone bargained for.
Yeah. And yeah, it's this whole thing where it seems like, why is he so concerned about his legacy or whatever? But it's more about when you're poor at this point in history, this is one of the only ways that you can rise above your station because the whole class system is a little more malleable in times of war. It's kind of a more egalitarian system for being able to rise up.
Yeah.
So that was really his main thing, I think.
I think you're right. So he says, I will fight for this land. I'm going to be a soldier so that I can rise up in this thing. But there's only one man who can give us a command.
Introducing General Washington.
Venerated Virginian veteran whose men are all lining up to put him upon a pedestal.
Yeah, and so they changed the rhyme from Gilbert and Sullivan, I am the very model of a modern major general, from mineral to men are all. So that's it's really clever.
Mineral.
My men are all lined up, whatever he says.
Yeah, and he gets into that whole Pirates of Penzance message there. I love that.
And Lin-Manuel, he said something, and I didn't go to check, but he basically said most of the time when George Washington is talking, he's speaking in a very straightforward, authoritative, proper way of speaking. He's not really rapping, but he does like these simple rhymes, except when he gets angry, and then he'll do like more complicated rhyme schemes and stuff. He said, "Can I get real a second for just a millisecond?" That whole situation comes because he's just kind of frustrated with the situation.
Yeah, a lot of George Washington's lines are actually direct quotes from something he really did say in history, supposedly.
Another thing that's kind of interesting to virtually no one probably, but earlier in the song where they say 32,000 troops, they say 32,000 three times, which when you add it up is 96,000, which is the song from In the Heights. But apparently he did that subconsciously. He didn't notice he was doing that.
Yeah.
Which if he did, that would be weird. But he said 32,000 only three times in the song, so it's weird. You should listen to that song too. It's good.
In the Heights is great. So Washington walks out and he kind of outlines the big problems that are there for the military themselves. We're outgunned, we're outmanned, outnumbered, outplanned, and we got to make an all-out stand. I'm going to need a right-hand man. And then in the staging of all of this, he's walked out and he's all the troops are lining up. They're saluting their general. And then everything kind of pauses for a second. And all of the people that are in the cast and the ensemble kind of freeze for a moment. And he steps forward and starts talking to the audience as if everything is frozen for a while. And he says, "Can I be real a second? For just a millisecond. Let down my guard and tell the people how I feel a second." Rhymes the word second 3 times. It's not a very creative thing.
Yeah, it goes from him talking to his troops, and then you get like that inner moment, almost like it goes from reading a speech of his to reading like a personal letter of his. Here's his
Zach
inner
Morris.
thoughts.
Yeah, he's doing the Zach Morris thing. He's talking to the audience now. That's a good point. And he talks about how the soldiers are all putting him up on a pedestal when they write their letters to their family. They're talking about how fantastic and noble their general is and how great he is and how ready they are to defend their country. At this point in time, in the Battle of Long Island, the Declaration of Independence had just been signed a month ago, and Washington had led his forces into Manhattan and made them listen to the Declaration, and so everyone is excited to fight for their independence, fight for the things that they just learned about here, and they're really enthusiastic, and Washington says they're really excited to serve me here, but the truth is in their face when they hear the British cannons go boom.
The elephant is in the room, because it's like, that's the elephant in the room, is that they're way better than us.
Yeah. Yeah, you hear some of Washington's fears and doubts. You see any hope of success is fleeting. How can I keep leading when the people I'm leading keep retreating? But put a stop to the bleeding as the British take Brooklyn. Knights takes Rook, but look. We are outgunned, outmanned, outnumbered, outplanned.
So he puts it into a chess metaphor. Knight takes Rook, but this isn't the end of the game. It's not checkmate necessarily. And he jumps right back into addressing his troops. The aside is done, and he is now announcing the problem again. And I like the transition here between Washington's scene and Hamilton's scene, where Washington shouts, "Incoming!" And then Hamilton is running and trying to defend his area of the city in particular. He's like, they're battering down the battery. Check their damages.
Yeah, Hamilton and Mulligan together come in here. We're seeing what they're doing and the actual action of the war here.
Yeah, bringing up Hamilton and Mulligan in this context does remind me, there was actually a particular story that seems pretty credible where when they're building up their actual forts and they're getting ready for this huge confrontation, the biggest fight as far as numbers go, the largest battle in the actual Revolutionary War is right here on Long Island in New York City. Hamilton and Mulligan go across the East River into Brooklyn Heights, and they look at the actual forts and how they have ditches around them and the way they're organized. And Hamilton and Mulligan start discussing it this is while Hamilton is living at Mulligan's house, and they have a discussion over dinner one evening and decide this is not going to work. Hamilton's a strategist to his core. He loves reading about histories, reading about war, reading about how things work. He's been obsessed with war, as we've talked about. And he looks at this from a strategic point of view, and he says, we are going to lose Brooklyn if we don't change the way this is set up. So he and Mulligan got together, and they wrote an anonymous letter to George Washington. Because at this point in the song and in his life, Hamilton was not yet familiar with George Washington on an actual... He couldn't walk into his office and specifically have Washington in his pocket yet. So he writes anonymously with Mulligan saying, hey, these are the things I noticed about your fort locations and your actual cannon arrangements and how you might want to change this if you want to defend against the British here. There's no evidence that Washington ever actually read that letter. If he did, he may not have even known that it was connected to Hamilton or not, but they did deliver an anonymous letter trying to get that. I imagine it got about as much response as an anonymous letter might today. Like if you put, like if someone sends you an anonymous thing, you'll probably just delete it and you don't
Especially
care.
if you're, a prominent general in the middle of a war.
It's possible. Yeah, I'd probably read it because, why not? Free letter.
I think it's kind of interesting to point out that all of Mulligan's lines here are just sounds.
Shaboom!
Just sound effects. He's not actually saying words. I don't know that it's actually representative of anything that they're having him specifically do it, but it's kind of cool to have someone there doing the sound effects of the war.
He is the hype.
Yeah.
So everything starts going really badly at this point, where boom goes the cannon, watch the blood and the stuff spray. Boom goes the cannon. We're abandoning Kip's Bay. And so everything is going poorly for the colonial troops. Washington has to divvy up his forces. He has to defend Manhattan, and he has to defend Brooklyn, and he has all these forces in different places, and he decides to divvy up his forces, and it really hurts the Continental cause to be spread out so much. There's a line in Washington's complaint here at the end when everything is going bad. They're getting super close to giving up. They're facing mad scrutiny, and he screams in the face of this mass mutiny. So as he finally just declares that they need to retreat and do an orderly retreat like Washington expected, he sees that his men are actually going off in different directions. They're frantically terrified, running from the British forces.
I think it's worth noting that these are not trained soldiers. These are just citizen soldiers, people of all ages and occupations who picked up these guns and went to fight for what they believe in. But when they come face to face with a trained army, you can see why they would be terrified and retreat.
Yeah, it's understandable. And for a man who has a reputation of being a noble, exquisite man, Washington had a wrath that whenever it was revealed was pretty strong and terrifying. And if you read the Chernow biography, there's this detailed anecdote about Washington when his troops are retreating from Manhattan in the middle of the night. We ride at midnight. He sees that his troops are fleeing with terror, and he takes off his hat and he throws it on the ground. And he says, "Are these the men with which I am to defend America?" And I'd obviously heard the musical before I read the biography, and so I thought, oh, wow, that's neat that Washington decided to quote Lin-Manuel.
Right. Yeah, apparently when they're running away from Kip's Bay or whatever, he rides his horse down into his men, trying to force him to go back the other way, and they won't, so he just starts swatting at people with his sword.
He's corralling them.
And I just thought it was weird because the thing I read said that he was swatting at people with his sword, but I feel like what's the difference between a swat with a sword and a slash or a stab or something?
I feel like even if you're trying to use the broadside, you can still cut somebody really easily.
Especially when they're just riding at you and you're riding towards them. It's can you really differentiate between a swat and a swipe? Or I don't know.
Yeah.
He's probably fine. He knows what he's doing.
He's handy with the steel. So you can see the pressure rising over Washington here, and he's just getting overwhelmed. And this last line, "I cannot be everywhere at once. People, I'm in dire need of assistance." Then Burr steps right in. "Your Excellency, sir." Almost like, here's my time. Here's my advantage. Here's my place to shine. I can finally make something of myself and be ahead of Hamilton, which at this point, I guess he's not necessarily in competition with Hamilton, but this is the beginning of it right here where he wants to get that foot in the door and become somebody.
Yeah, this is the first scene where we see our protagonist and our antagonist have exactly the same goal. They want to rise up and get Washington's approval, and Aaron Burr is pushing for it. He's pursuing approval, and even though they're both after that same identical goal, only one of them can succeed. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but I love when Washington burns Aaron Burr, and you see him just say, "Close the door on your way out."
Well, I kind of feel like right here, the first thing is kind of a burn. Your Excellency, sir, who are you? and then you have the question that echoes back to Aaron Burr, sir. Aaron Burr, sir?
Yeah.
Permission to state my case? Like he says it with a question mark.
So when Burr walks into the office, he states his case, kind of gives his resume, saying, I was a captain under General Montgomery when, in one of the first aggressive forces the Continental Army took in this battle, they went to the Battle of Quebec, and they were trying to take out the British forces there. General Montgomery did die in that battle. There's an epic poem that's written about that particular battle, and it paints Burr as the hero, where he tries to lift up his fallen general and tries to drag him through the snow, but they're like, Burr's not a tall guy. He's not a really strong man. And so when he's trying to carry General Montgomery out of the battle, he's completely overwhelmed. He's not able to take him. He gets stuck in these snowdrifts, and he eventually has to leave him there and then come back for his general later after the battle goes down. So he puts this as a resume out there saying, I was a captain under General Montgomery until he'd caught a bullet in the neck in Quebec. And well, in summary, I have some things to offer you, George Washington. I'm kind of important, and I want you to give me a place on your staff. And so he kind of presents himself there and asks for a position in Washington. He wants to give some help.
And I like how here in the lyrics he says, I admire how you keep firing on the British from a distance. He's specifically like almost pushing that point of view he has. Like, let's just stay back over here. Let's not jump into the face first. Let's not be rash here, which is kind of the opposite of what Hamilton would like to do in his personality.
And what Washington would prefer to be doing, but he's had to be firing from a distance, and it's probably not his first choice. So pointing it out is not what he wants to do, hence his response. Huh.
Right. In history, Aaron Burr did serve on George Washington's staff for a short period of time. And depending on the biographer you read, you're either going to see that Aaron Burr and George Washington had this huge personality clash and a huge falling out, and so Burr went off to serve under another general, or you're going to see that they didn't really interact very much at all, and Aaron Burr just decided that he didn't want to be one of dozens of aides for George Washington. He would rather be the one aide for a lesser general, so that he thought that might be a faster route to climbing in the ranks and becoming an advanced officer specifically. So eventually, Burr does leave and ties himself to another general. That's kind of an interesting point. At this point in time, one of the greatest routes to success for a person enlisting in the army who wanted to rise up, it's a lot about who you know. And so they would pick their generals. They'd say, I want to attach myself to George Washington because he's leading the forces. And if you could get to being his right-hand man, you would be somebody after the war. And so while Burr had to specifically push his way into George Washington's presence and try to make his case, Hamilton walks in and he says, Your Excellency, you wanted to see me?
Yeah, complete contrast to the way Burr, and they're saying, oh, who am I? Oh, I'm Aaron Burr. And like, you don't even know me. But then Hamilton walks in, oh, you requested my presence here, didn't you? And then Washington's response, Hamilton, oh, I know you.
And he introduces him to Burr. Have you met Burr? Yes, sir. We keep meeting. And Burr tries to continue his sales pitch, so to speak. He says, as I was saying, I look forward to seeing your strategy play out. And then Washington just burns him, saying, Burr, close the door on your way out. I wish in the cast recording we had a little more time to react to that, because that is a huge moment where, like, that's going to come back and haunt him. There are a few moments like that in the recording where Lin-Manuel didn't give us a lot of time to react to this incredible thing that just happened on stage. Now we're into the next thing really quickly. So while Aaron Burr had to make a sales pitch to Washington, Washington actually comes in and he's making a sales pitch to Hamilton, trying to recruit him specifically. He says, I know that you've gotten recognition for all the things you've done downtown as a soldier and the things you've specifically been able to accomplish. And he says, Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, who's eventually George Washington's Secretary of War, these guys really wanted to hire you. And Hamilton says, yeah, to be a secretary. I don't think that's what I want with life. I don't think so. And Washington's like, why are you upset about that? And he says, I know it's all right that you want to fight. You've got a hunger, something that we've referenced earlier in this show, where he's wanting to pursue something. Washington says, you have head full of fantasies of dying like a martyr. Yes, dying is easy, young man. Living is harder, which is cool because Washington repeats that phrase again in the second act, or repeats something similar to it, mirrors that phrase with winning was easy, young man. Governing's harder.
Yeah, so Hamilton goes in there, and Washington is impressed that Hamilton led a group of people to steal cannons. He stole like 20 out of 25 of the British cannons in this spot, like in the previous year. So I guess he's been following his career since then, according to this song. And Hamilton is he thinks a lot of himself, and Washington does a little like trying to encourage him to not just die for glory, but to try to live for something. So, because he says dying is easy, young man, living is harder.
Yeah, I love that line.
And you're like, what? And then so Washington tries to start telling him what some of his problems are. It says, I'm working with what a third of the Congress has promised, which Congress can't promise anything because under their Articles of Confederation, they can't tax. The states are not. Yeah. It's not a country, it's states.
The states
and they
had
can
to
help
decide.
out or not. So most of them chose to not.
Right.
So yeah, so for most of the Revolutionary War, they're dealing with just whatever charity they can find, but not nearly enough to actually have the resources that they need. And so Washington would also do a lot of stuff where he would pretend like they had a lot more rounds of ammunition than they did, just to not scare people. So he would like spread misinformation to say like, well, we've got 100,000 rounds of ammunition, and they really have like 10,000. They didn't have enough guns to go around, but
yeah, trying to keep morale up.
Yeah,
I like he ends that by saying to Hamilton, "So," with a question mark, and Hamilton, well, actually, the company jumps in, repeating that refrain, "I'm not throwing away my shot," and then Hamilton jumps in that last part, "I'm not throwing away my shot," as a reply to Washington, like what he's going to do and who he is. Like, let me tell you. My answer to this is I'm not throwing away my shot. Because
as many times as they can throw in, "I'm not throwing away my shot," before he ends up throwing his shot away at the end, the better. They can cement that idea in the musical for some foreshadowing. And so then he kind of turns Hamilton loose to be his right-hand man in this situation. So Hamilton starts sending his friends off to take care of business, as they might say.
So Washington goes back to the beginning of where he was at this song. He says, "We are outgunned and outmanned." And Hamilton says, "Okay, I'm on your staff now. I have an answer to those problems. You'll need all the help you can get. I have some friends, Lawrence, Mulligan, Marquis de Lafayette. Okay, that addresses the fact that you were outmanned, and I can fix your problems here. Yeah. I have something to help you."
I do think it's interesting, if I can jump back just a couple of lines, Washington calls him son here, which will come up later. So just pocket that one for a future episode.
We're outnumbered and outplanned. And so Hamilton says, in response to that, we need to get some spies on the inside, some kingsmen who might let some things slide, which
helps with the whole outplanned situation, because they're coming up with their own plans to find out what their plans are. So they end up doing that. He writes to Congress, tells them they need supplies. He rallied the guys, mastered the element of surprise. So that also helps to kind of level the playing field. And then he says, "I'll rise up on my station, organize your information till we rise to the occasion of our new nation." So yeah, he's still keeping in mind his whole overall goal here of rising above his station that he was born from. And then we got some more "Here Come the General Rise Ups." And the liner notes to this song, at one point, the chorus says, "Buck, buck, 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 buck." And it's like, what? Because it doesn't sound like they're actually saying that on the recording at all. But for some reason in the lyrics, it says the word buck 10 times, which I thought was weird, because it's like, $10, Alexander Hamilton.
Whoa.
That is really weird.
Like, I get that, like, it's supposed to mimic the sound of gunshots and such.
Right.
So there's $10.
But there's $10.
Buck, 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 buck. Buck, 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 buck.
So, I don't know. Take that as you want.
So this song has taken us all the way through Hamilton's rise to glory, where he's gone from a lowly captain among the auxiliary forces there, and he's now officially the right-hand man of George Washington, the leader of the Continental Forces. His particular rank there did come with the promotion to lieutenant colonel. Not that it really matters, though, because it wasn't a combat rank. It was kind of an aide-de-camp to him specifically.
Which we'll see the frustration in Hamilton grow over that fact shortly in the musical.
Right. So we've already discussed the beginning of A Winter's Ball in last week's episode, but I do want to just highlight that really quickly now, because we've seen Aaron Burr's getting spurned by George Washington, not getting what he wanted. We've seen that Hamilton is the one who gets exactly what Burr was going after. And so the line that Burr has after this particular rise to glory is he says, again, as a scene transition, he uses that refrain that he's used to using. How does a bastard orphan, son of a whore, go on and on, grow into more of a phenomenon? Watch this obnoxious, arrogant, loudmouth bother be seated at the right hand of the Father. Washington hires Hamilton right on sight, but Hamilton still wants to fight, not right. So we see there that Hamilton is still pursuing, he still wants to become a soldier. He's still going to ask for command of a battalion so that he can become a military hero in particular. But right now he's positioned himself at exactly the place he needs to be to rise above his station after the war.
So that wraps us up for this week, and we're going to explore next week Aaron Burr. We're going to see more about his character, who he is.
He's so fascinating.
Yes, and his response to everything that's happened so far. We're going to be jumping back into the order of the songs here. So until next week, I'm Vinton Bayne at Flesh Eater on Twitter.
I'm Robbie Hurlocker at Alpha Knight on Twitter.
Oh, I'm James. You can Google James on internet. So yeah, thanks for letting me be here, guys. I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, graphocast.com. Follow us on Twitter at Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.